Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snugglebug Stitching, and today we are having a look at this t-shirt quilt that I just finished. And I'm going to talk about the binding a little bit. When I first started making quilts, the binding was really one of the steps that stressed me out the most. And the part of binding that stressed me out the most was getting the edges, so the ends, the part where you start the binding and the part where you finish the binding off, joined together smoothly. I always felt like I either cut it too long or too short, or it ended up being twisted, and it really stressed me out. So for this tutorial today, we're going to be looking at joining the ends of your binding with a flat seam. So I've used a flat seam in this quilt to sew my binding strips together. I feel like doing it that way is faster and easier, and you don't have any waste like you would with a diagonal seam at the point where you sew each strip together. Now, with the seams pressed open, I don't feel like this adds significant bulk, but if you're going to make your quilt for a quilt show, then you might want to do the diagonal seams because the judges might ding you for the flat seams. I do plan on doing a tutorial for joining the ends of the binding with the diagonal seam later on this month, but for today we're talking about these flat seams. So let's look at the place where I join this binding on this one. So you can see that seam there, and it doesn't look any different than all the other seams in the binding. So this right here is where I join those seams, and you can't tell any difference between it and the other places where I join the binding. And there is a method that a lot of people use that I used to use a lot too. It's a great method. It's easy. You don't have to do any measuring, where you sort of make a pouch and tuck the ends of the binding together in that. So here's one that I did like that. This is the part where I join the binding, and this is a great easy method, no measuring, but the drawback to this one is, me personally, I was never able to get that so that you couldn't tell where those binding seams were joined. So if you compare this part right here, this is where I join those edges, to a regular seam in the binding, I have to get really close to even see that there is a seam, and then it's pretty hard to see. You can see it right there. But if you compare those, they don't look the same. It's obvious where you joined it. So I wanted an easier way to join the ends of the binding so that all the seams look the same, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, quilters, so today we are going to go over a little tutorial for joining the ends of the binding, making the seam where we join the end of the binding look the same as our other seams, and we're going to use a flat seam, not a diagonal seam, for this one. So when I first started quilting, binding was probably one of the most stressful parts, and one of the things that I always found stressful about binding was trying to join these seams like this. And a couple of issues that you tend to run into is making them the right length and not having them twisted up when you go to join them. So this method is going to help you with both of those things. So you're going to look at these two ends of the binding. This end of the binding is where I started putting the binding on, and you can see that I have about 6 to 8 inches extra. So I started sewing the binding on about 6 to 8 inches down from the end of the seam, and I did start this part right here about in the middle of that side of the quilt. Now this other side here is the side that I cut off at the end, cut a little bit of the extra off, so you can see it's not very square because I just cut it off with scissors. So we're going to put that side on the bottom. So you'll place that flush with the edge of your quilt, and you want to have it laying nice and flat. You don't want to stretch it, but just make sure it's laying nice and flat. And then take your other side and do the same thing with it, overlapping those. And this side is the side that should be squared off already, so that's the side that we want to be on top. And so we've got those two flush, and we're going to, once we get those two flush and flattened out against the edge of the quilt, we're going to grab a pencil, and I'm just using a white colored pencil here because this is what's going to show up better on this black binding. And we're going to use that to mark that spot where those two overlap. Once you mark that spot, you're going to get your, kind of pull that piece out, and you're going to grab a ruler. And I've just got a little square ruler here. It doesn't really matter what size ruler, just a little, it can be a small ruler, big ruler, whatever you have. And we're going to line that up so that we can cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you want to make sure that that 1/4 inch seam allowance is between the line we drew and the outside of that piece of binding. So we'll use our ruler to cut, and our rotary cutter to cut that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now that we've got our binding, the ends of the binding cut to the right lengths so they can match up nicely, now let's make it so that we don't twist those up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to fold the quilt in on itself like I did here, and you can either use a big clip like I did, or a clothespin, whichever one you have. And that is actually just going to make it so that when you go and take that over to your machine, then these two pieces that you need to sew together are closer together, and it's not going to be as hard for you to do that. So now that that's clipped, what we're going to do is we're going to take the ends of your binding, and you're going to grab one of them and fold it back like I just did there. And then you're going to grab the other one and bring it over to meet it. And it's fine if they're a little bit different lengths. They will match up when we're done. But now that we've got that, we're going to grab both pieces. And I'm going to kind of zoom in here. You can see there are 4 layers. Since each one was folded over, you've got 4 layers here. And we're going to grab those 2 middle layers of fabric like that. And then, now that we've got hold of those 2 middle layers, we're going to pull that out so that the fabric is back sides together. And this little, you can see this little mark here, that's not going to show after your quilt is done because this part will be on the inside. But now that we've got those 2 like this, that makes it so that your binding strips are wrong sides together, and that's the way that they need to be so that when you sew them together, they're not twisted. So now that we have these 2 pieces, we're just gonna, you'll just line them up nicely and pin them. I just use a couple of pins, and then you'll take that over to your sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now that we have these 2 ends sewn together, you can see here that my binding is not twisted, and it's going to make a nice fit. So you'll just press this seam open like you did all the other seams, and you'll come up here, take this to your sewing machine, start sewing where you left off. I usually take a couple back stitches, go to this part where you started on this side, and I usually take a couple back stitches, and then your binding at that point will be ready to flip over and attach it to the other side. Now when you press this, you can run back to your iron, but if you don't have an ironing station close, you can just finger press it open. Sometimes I actually finger press it open and put a little glue on each side to glue it in place for me, but you can do that however you want to. And then I'll sew this on and show you how it turned out. Okay, so now we have our 2 ends of our binding joint, and it fit nicely. You can see there's not any puckering on there like it would be if we'd made it too small. The seam isn't twisted, and also you can see that this seam looks the same as the other seams in the quilt, so you won't be able to tell where the binding was joined together.